So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Always a hard act to follow coming on after Peter Carter and JD. But luckily for us, we've got an esteemed lineup of panellists here today to tackle the question of what next for the Murray-Darling Basin plan. Just out of interest, show of hand, who's an irrigator in the audience?
I'm an ex-irrigator.
Well, that'll count. You can put your hand up. Hey, north, south. Hey, you got a bit of a lead out of that?
Yep.
Excellent, thank you. So we might jump straight into this. We've promised Matt and Derek that we'll try to claw back a little bit of time for you in this session as well. So we're aiming for a 45-minute session. We're going to jump straight into it by introducing the panellists for you. And so hopefully up on the screens we'll have a quick profile of each of the panellists. Which end will we start? We'll start with at the far end with Mark McKenzie. So Mark's the CEO of New South Wales Irrigators Council, which has 25 member organisations, including New South Wales Farmers, and representing over 12,000 water access licence holders in New South Wales. He's had a long career with the Australian wine industry and wine sector, longer than just the relationship that many of you had with the wine industry last night at Parliament House. Being a representative, CEO of the Victorian Wine Industry Association and Wine Grape Growers Australia. Mark also is an olive grower down in Victoria, which I'll just add in there. He's very proud, and anyone who wants to talk to him about that afterwards, I'm sure he'd be delighted. We might go from go up to the national level for a second, and we have Steve Whan here, who's the CEO of the National Irrigators Council. So Steve will be known to many in this room. He's held formerly portfolios of New South Wales Minister for Primary Industries, New South Wales Minister for Emergency Services, for Small Business, for Rural Affairs, and has now been, 6 months, Steve, in the role at National Irrigators Council, based out of Canberra. So welcome, Steve. We'll go back to, so Phil Glyde. I think Phil's known to many in this room, probably known best to the people in this room through his role in the UK Government Cabinet Office and the OECD in Paris, which are true, but probably not how you know him. You know him, of course, over a decade as a senior executive within the Federal Department of Agriculture, and you'd know him from areas and topics like live exports and so forth over recent years. Now, obviously, CEO of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Gavin Hanlon, who I hope is well known to many in the audience here, Deputy Director General for Water within New South Wales DPI, and one of the best centres ever produced by Temora. Gavin will get a chance to talk to you a bit later on. And we're going to round out with Perin Davey. So we'll jump one more forward to Perin. So many of you also know Perin, former Murray Irrigation, Corporate Affairs and Stakeholder Engagement. Previously, a background in journalism. And I think, Perin, if I remember a story, you started your work with Murray Irrigation 2 days after the release of the guide for the proposed Murray-Darling Basin plan. So has a long history in the rollout and development of the plan. And finally, but certainly not least, Tony Quigley, New South Wales irrigated cotton farmer from near Nevertire, who I think the family's been farming since 1970 in that block.
Oh no, we've been there since 1888.
Since 1888, he looks young for his age, doesn't he? So look, I thought I might get the ball rolling by asking a few questions just to make sure that we get some dialogue started with the panellists, and then we might go to the mics for questions to be asked from the floor. I'm going to start though because you know what, it's been decades of political wrangling, decades of media headlines, everything from water wars through to the Great Water swindle. Sometimes it's easy to lose sight of what was intended by this plan, and so what I might do is ask Steve Whan to put that national hat on and to help remind us what was the intent of this plan and what is its end goal. What are we trying to achieve as this plan rolls out?
Well, thanks. And of course, when this plan started, I was able to be a very parochial New South Wales representative, and that was interesting at the time. But 25th of January 2007, you might remember the then Prime Minister John Howard standing up and announcing the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and I guess the very simple premise that he had behind it, which fortunately still seems to flow through most of the political leaders when they talk about it, is to achieve a sustainable water use in the basin, in a working basin. So John Howard, when he spoke about it, talked about increasing agricultural production and at the same time decreasing water use and making it sustainable. That flowed through to the various following governments that we've had and has, I think, fortunately formed the basis of a largely bipartisan approach at the political level to the Basin Plan, but which obviously hides the fact that underneath that there's been an awful lot of heartache and hard work by the people involved in it.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. So I guess with the benefit of having the MDBA here, so Phil, given that framework of what was intended and what started, where are we up to? And what's the next big steps in terms of the rollout of the plan?
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to New South Wales farmers for the opportunity to be here.
I think you've got to press the...
It's on. Whoosh. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, thanks to Scott, thanks to New South Wales farmers for the opportunity to be here. I think the important thing, as Steve said, it's a fairly long-run commitment. We're year 5 in a 12-year implementation plan. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan is actually not complete until 2024, deliberately designed to be so, to give people time to react to what is a really significant change in circumstances. Just in terms of what's coming up in 2017, 6 months ago, there's quite a bit of a ruckus around a ministerial council meeting where a lot of concerns about various aspects of the plan. On the 9th of June this year, COAG met and they stressed the importance of maintaining the momentum to implement the Basin Plan on time and in full. So whilst some states have had some concerns, at a national level, that broad bipartisanship that Steve talked about still remains. From my perspective, 2017 is a year of change. We divide the basin up into 2 bits, the north, essentially north of Menindee, and the south below Menindee, and most of New South Wales, of course, but there were pre-programmed opportunities to change. So for the north, we're recommending an amendment to the Basin Plan, a reduction of 70 gigalitres, which is 18% of the water that had previously been designed to be returned to the environment, will reduce the amount of water going back to the environment. That's because we had a close look at it. Another 4 years of study, we've come up with a better balance. That recommendation, because the Basin Plan is a piece of legislation, that has to go through the Commonwealth Parliament, has to go through the Senate. We're hoping to get the amendment to Minister Joyce in the next couple of weeks, and then it would be introduced not long after that. That's a pretty significant step. In the south, it has its own mechanism for that adjustment. That is actually coming to fruition in 2017. Essentially up to about 27% of the water that had been designed to be returned to the environment can be returned if we can find better ways, more efficient ways of using environmental water. By the 30th of June, so a couple of weeks ago, the states nominated a bunch of projects that enable us to get pretty close to that 650 gigalitre reduction. In fact, we advised the Ministerial Council it could be upwards of 600. That's a significant milestone. We'll spend the next couple of months modelling that to prove that that is the case, that you get equivalent environmental outcomes from using much less water, 27% less water returned to the environment. We'll then come out with public consultation in around October, and our job is to get an amendment to the Basin Plan to Minister Joyce by the 15th of December. If he agrees with it, it goes into the Commonwealth Parliament early next year for amendment. So 2017, main message, really big year of change, and the important thing is that those amendments for both the North and the South have to get through the Senate. And so we can expect a little bit of political wrangling as that goes on in the next few months. 2017, also a year of report cards. Some of you who are familiar with water will know that the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists has put out a report card that's pretty damning. There's also a gentleman called Quentin Grafton, a professor, who's put out a report that says we haven't got anywhere. And I think on Monday night, Four Corners will be issuing its own report card on the progress since 2007 with the water reforms. I don't expect that to be terribly complimentary. But we, the MDBA, are also producing a comprehensive report card by the end of 2017 about what's been the economic, environmental and social consequences of the introduction of the plan. That will be reporting on the good, the bad and the ugly. We know that there's been some adverse consequences. We know that there's been some benefits. We would like to try and get them down in a more fair way than perhaps some of those earlier studies have done. And I guess finally the other moving part, and those of you familiar with the jargon, there is another part of the Basin Plan that is about getting even more water returned to the environment. It's 450 gigalitres of upwater. Again, a bit of jargon, but essentially it's about, in the same way as improving the efficiency of how we use environmental water, can we get even more efficiency out of on-farm use, and can that be returned to the environment? That's a really quite a debatable point amongst ministers, and there's a study underway. There'll be a report by December, which is what would be the consequences of that, and can we design a mechanism that meets up to the principle of the plan, which is that water should not be returned to the environment if there's an adverse economic and social consequence. So that's being done by Ernst & Young and will be done by December. So essentially, I come back to what I started with. We're 5 years in to a long-run process. It's still a long way to go, and there's 7 years left to design and build and approve and operate all these new pieces of infrastructure and rules. But I guess the plan is going well, Scott, but it's not without pain. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. So, by the sound of that, year 5 out of the 12-year plan is a pretty significant year in the life of the plan. Drilling down to a state level, I might ask Gavin Hanlon. So, Gavin, given all that, what's ahead for New South Wales? What's our state's perspective of what's the opportunity and the risks over these next couple of years?
So I guess from our end, there's some short and medium and long-term things we need to be looking at based on that. Around June, the states agreed on a package of works and measures for the MDBA to be modelled, as Phil mentioned. Between now and Christmas, we have to negotiate how the funding for those projects might flow and the principles around that. So for us, things like for the projects to progress, they've got to be based on extensive community consultation. The funding's got to be available in full. They've got to demonstrate there's no third-party impacts. So that's between now and Christmas. As part of that, we've got to work through what the delivery arrangements for those projects might be. So some of them lend themselves to civil-type projects where Water New South Wales are best placed to deliver those. But some of them lend themselves to more localised delivery arrangements. So we've got to finalise those sort of things between now and Christmas. Medium term, we have to work through and develop something like 22 water resource plans where we have to demonstrate at a regional or a catchment level our compliance with the Basin Plan. That process is well and truly started. I think out of the 22, we've issued something like 20 issues and status papers, which is a first step. I think the Lachlan, Glyde and Macquarie are now moving beyond that. They've prioritised what it is they want to work on and have started drafting their actual plans. But there's a lot of work around developing those things. And then finally, over the longer term, we have to start thinking about, once all this infrastructure is built, how it will actually be operated. And you can't really have that discussion on the detail until the infrastructure is actually built or being close to being finalised. So, for example, the Living Murray projects were designed a lot like this process here, had assumptions around how they would operate. None of the projects were actually built as they were designed in the end, nor any of them operate the way they were designed to or intended to operate. Some of them much better, some of them because of latent conditions once they started construction. So I think it just makes sense to have the operating discussions further down the track when you get closer to the end, so you get a bit better feel for how they might actually work. I think importantly for those operating arrangements that we've got to negotiate as well over the longer term, that we know that in doing that there's opportunities for potentially flood mitigation. We learned off the back of last year's floods that changes in some of those rules will deliver environmental outcomes, but at the same time might deliver some flood mitigation benefits. But there's a hell of a lot of work you've got to do to make sure the infrastructure is in place and that the operating rules don't trip up reliability and those sort of things. So I guess, Scott, over the next couple of years for us, there's a continual drop down into levels of detail as we get further and further past the halfway mark.
Thanks, Gavin. So, Mark McKenzie, I mean, the devil's always in the detail in these plans. The high, lofty goals are always well intended. It's the details and how these are implemented that often define their success or otherwise. What are the details that you're watching for on behalf of your members over this next period?
Scott, I figure in the first instance, we've basically drawn a line in the sand on productive water being returned to the environment from here, unless, like the recent Tandau sale, it can be done in such a way that there are not third-party impacts. In other words, it's a win-win, a strategic purchase. But certainly in most established irrigation districts, the view is there has been very significant economic and social damage already. Phillip's pointed to it. It's clear in the north, it's not as clear in the south. The NDBA's work is still continuing on that, but the bottom line for us is, and I believe the Minister has reiterated this, that there be no more water taken out of production because a lot of communities are at tipping point. So in the first instance, the detail is around understanding that, because I think there is still a discussion happening between federal and state governments about what neutrality looks like in the context of the triple bottom line, measuring impact on social and economic outcomes within communities. Now, we're an irrigators body, so we're obviously working with irrigators and irrigator companies or irrigation companies at the coalface, but the reality is that they all operate within regional economies. So it's very important to understand those third-party impacts from what already has been recovered and potentially how the rules, the moving parts, as Gavin and Phillip have talked about, how they're likely to impact. And part of that is also going to be impacts. For instance, the basic proposition of moving more water through the system is potentially going to flood private landholders' land from time to time. So understanding the impact on landholders who may well be riparian graziers but aren't irrigators per se. Then in terms of the people we represent, irrigators, we have been so keen ongoing to have all of the detail. And to be honest, we're impatient because we want more of the detail about what's being proposed, how the infrastructure is going to be managed, how the rules are going to be changed in storages, in river operations, in managing those flows and in integrating what comes down the pipe, if I can put it that way, for the environment compared to what irrigators require at peak times of the year. In other words, channel capacity issues and those sorts of issues. And I have to say the frustration for us is, while we're looking to see what the third-party impacts are and try to minimise those for communities and landholders, the frustration, I think, is that an awful lot of irrigators are sitting on floodplains, and we are very, very keen to understand exactly what the impact of more water down the chute is going to be, and what are the impacts of those rules, and how are they likely to impact on reliability and access, or indeed potentially having an impact through flood situations within their land. So a lot of moving parts. Part of why we're in existence is to keep a watching brief on that, work closely with governments and particularly with the authority to ensure that as soon as those facts, assumptions and modelling is done, that we've actually got something that we can have a sensible discussion about.
So, Steve, is that a mirror of what you hear from your other state organisations in terms of what they're watching for?
I guess one of the key points is that despite what we hear about South Australia having very strongly different views to New South Wales and Victoria on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, its irrigators are very much the same as irrigators in Victoria and New South Wales. And they're also concerned to make sure that we don't see any more purchase or buyback of water, as Mark mentioned. That's a key issue for all irrigators. There is concerns which mirror some of those that Mark talked about with which relate to removing constraints in the system. So constraints are about ensuring that the amount of water that is needed for the environment and even for irrigators down river can be delivered. So when Mark talks about the fears of flooding and so on from that, that's also an issue which concerns the Goulburn Murray area in Victoria, in which the Victorian government expresses quite a lot of concern about. That area there has very similar concerns to some of the Riverina, with fears about water being brought out and leaving a patchwork and affecting the viability of the infrastructure that's in the area. And that's obviously a serious concern. That's, particularly in those dairying areas, is a concern about not just government buyback, but also we have a water market. So the water is moving to the areas where it's most valuable, and at the moment that's almonds, and that's often outside of the sort of areas like the Goulburn Murray and down into Mildura and South Australia, with people pumping from rivers. So what that does is exacerbates that impact of government taking water, which has happened, to reduce the viability of the irrigation infrastructure in those areas. So, as I said, I think irrigators in most areas have similar concerns in most states, and there is obviously at times some tension between different areas, but the core of their concerns are much the same. Governments, of course, have slightly different views. New South Wales and Victorian government are, from the point of view, I think, of irrigator groups, encouragingly aligned on most things at the moment. I'm not sure if Phillip says the same thing, but South Australia, I think, has gone through a phase of being a bit bolshy, I suppose, on some aspects, and came out smiling out of the last ministers' meeting. So you can take positives out of that as well, I think. So it's an interesting picture when you look at it at national level. Queensland, of course, is involved as well, but with slightly different issues, and some issues with over-allocation of groundwater and things in some of their areas, as I understand it, and some arguments with New South Wales as well in that.
Steve. So I'm going to ask Perin to have a look at this from a view of the glass is half full. We often hear about many of the challenges and many of the risks. Are there opportunities in what these next couple of years are setting out to be?
There are absolutely opportunities. Wherever there is risk, there are opportunities. I think some of the key things, and a lot of this is dependent on how the state governments go about implementing these last years of the Basin Plan. Phillip's quite right. This year is almost a make or break year with the SDL adjustment mechanism. If we can get those offsets, if you believe what has come from some of the governments, if we can get the offsets right, then there may be no need for further water recovery, which goes to Mark's point about no more recovery from the consumptive pool. And that means that the focus for individuals is about managing their business under the new regime and under the new rules. There is a water market now. The new water trade rules that apply equitably across the whole basin have made trade freer and easier through inter-valley and across-border trade. So it does give farmers an additional tool in their pocket, as long as they now look at water as a commodity in its own right, and it's not just an input cost anymore. Water is a commodity. I have seen for myself sometimes where farmers have been able to use the market to sell their water to pay their bills, whereas before the water market, they would have had those bills anyway, but not had that opportunity. In dry years when there's not enough water to plant a crop, they still have something they can do with that water. So there are opportunities, but it is really important that farmers get good access to information so that they can be informed about the water market, they can manage their businesses with good information to give them the confidence to be able to take advantage of the opportunities. The other opportunity that is there is, Gavin mentioned that we're developing the water resource plans. The state is developing the water resource plans. These are the rules that apply to each valley about how they manage their water resources at a valley level, and it's really important. There is no one size fits all with water. We have different valleys, different dams, different regimes in each valley. But it is an opportunity to have a close look at those rules and make sure that they're right, that they encourage production, that they support productive use of water while still achieving the goals and the objectives of balance.
Right. So, Tony, you sit here listening to the level of activity that's going to go on in these next couple of years, this next year in particular. As a producer, as someone who relies on stability in understanding what rules and what assets you have to work with, what are the opportunities, or what does it mean to you? Like, how does this play out for irrigators on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Realistically, in the irrigation communities, there's a fair bit of water fatigue out there. This process, the Murray-Darling Basin process, really only started in 2012, but the reform really started with the Water Management Act in 2000. So we've had 17 years of things changing under our feet. Some of which has been good, property rights for water, as Perin talked about, and tradability. A lot of those things have been useful to irrigators, but there's a lot of wear and tear happened on those communities, both through buybacks and through the time and the toll that it's taken to restructure organisations, restructure farms. And I guess that's being played out by the lack of infrastructure that's been taken up by farmers recently. Since 2014, not much has happened, and I think Phillip's had a lot more trouble extracting water that can't be done by buyback any longer from irrigation communities, and I think that fatigue's a real factor. It does worry me, though, that some people may be overlooking the opportunities that are there to either upgrade their off-river irrigation scheme or their farm, or even do things at a bigger regional level, simply from that fatigue. And the risk to farms and irrigation infrastructure operators is that the opposition's clearly put on the table that if they get back in power at the next election, that buybacks will be back on the table, and they see that as the most convenient and quickest way to get the rest of the water that's there, that they need to fulfil their obligation. As Tony Burke says, he wants the plan in full and on time. Well, that's all good, but some of the opportunities that people may not be looking at the moment may disappear, and I think this fatigue issue, maybe there needs to be some sort of incentive put out there for people to re-look at what opportunities are there and act on them while they're still there. And I guess when you've got fatigue in a community, that's much harder to re-energise.
Yeah. And at risk of sort of putting people here through water fatigue in these next sort of 20 minutes as well, I mean, part of the commentary that's come from here is this obvious conflicting views around the ability to deliver the intent of the plan with actually less water needed for environment to achieve the same environmental outcomes, and yet publicity in recent weeks of groups of scientists calling for, in some of the reports, up to a third more water needing to be delivered for those environmental outcomes. Is this just different filters being applied, or a misinterpretation of data, or is this just the alignment of the differing philosophies from what exists in a triple bottom line between environment, production and community? I might start with Phil.
Thanks, Scott. Great question. Look, I think it's a pretty simple equation to me. Back in 2012, for right or wrong, the best science available at the time set a number that would be the amount of water that needed to be returned to the environment in order to make sure you have that sustainable environment, a sustainable, healthy working basin that would also support industry. And I think what we've seen, because 2017 has been this pre-programmed year of change, we've seen a lot of the arguments that existed at the time when the Basin Plan was settled in 2012, we've seen a lot of that come back. So the Wentworth Group report that I think you're referring to has gone back often to that sort of debate, is that the right number? It really, for a lot of intents and purposes, we've got bipartisan support for this number. It's locked in. The science was in at the time, and I think it's just important that we continue on with it. And everyone has a right to their own opinion. But I was particularly stung by the criticism from the Wentworth Group that there'd been no environmental achievements, when I think, in fact, there's been quite significant environmental achievements. But you can't turn around, in essence, the consequences of 100 years of development, which has been beneficial, but 100 years of development, you can't turn that round in 5 years. And all the science says you're going to be looking for, 15, 20, 30 years before you see some change. So I just think it's a bit of an outbreak of yesterday's news, and it's important that we do keep focusing on the fact that we've got to a landing point. We've just got to deliver, as Gavin said, on getting the concrete in the ground and finding smarter ways to use water for environmental purposes.
Anyone else in the panel want to?
I'll have a crack at this because I love having a crack at the Wentworth Group because they call themselves scientists, but they refuse to use scientific methods. I mean, they really are living in the past on this, Scott. The reality of it is that they were very stung when their call for 4,000 gigalitres of water to be returned to the environment wasn't supported by the available science, but they're still trying to run that line. And the second thing that they and most other environmental lobbyists do is they just believe that the solution is to put more water down the tube. It's simply, in the case of native fish in particular, it demonstrably does not work. It's got to be quite closely managed. So, I think they just shoot themselves in the foot. They're running an agri-political lobby here, and they might call themselves concerned scientists, but they don't act like them.
Oh, we keep going along the line, Tony.
Yeah, I might have a crack here too. They're part of my favourite target group. I mean, I've had a quick look at their report. The couple of things that stick out to me clearly are that they're very much in favour of buybacks because they see that as the cheapest solution to fix the problem, but they don't then acknowledge that, well, they do then go on to acknowledge that the biggest cost of that is actually to the communities that water's come out of, and that's a long-term cost. It's there forever. But then they quickly want to stick a Band-Aid over it, which is a sort of a structural adjustment package to try and Band-Aid over those cracks that they've left in the masonry, and then when that money runs out, that community's left to fend for itself. So to me, it's a very short-term view that they have on what's the cheapest way to fulfil the Basin plan, and I certainly think there wouldn't be anyone in this room that would support it.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think the term report for their document is a bit loose. It was more of an opinion piece. They did actually acknowledge that where environmental water has been used, there are some localised outcomes. They just hid that in their sort of summary. And I'll go back to, I'll go back a bit. The irrigation industry has always been firm that any basin plan must be about outcomes. It can't be about numbers. The pain that is being felt in communities is as a result of entitlements being purchased. And that is what the Wentworth Group is advocating. Irrigation industry says, look, it shouldn't be about a magic number. It should be about, are you getting your frogs breeding, your fish breeding, your trees growing? Are you actually achieving outcomes on the ground? And I think it was a significant win on behalf of the irrigation industry a number of years ago to have the SDL adjustment mechanism built into the Basin plan so that there is an opportunity for governments to put forward projects and ideas about how they can use this huge volume of water that they already have better to get the outcomes on the ground so that they don't have to keep buying water. The other interesting note is the Wentworth Group, who, as Tony says, support buyback, years ago were saying that farmers were inefficient and we needed to get the water off the farmers because we're over-allocated. Well, farmers have addressed their efficiencies and now they're complaining about that because now they're saying, hang on, all of that leaky water is not coming back to the rivers, so we've got to do something. So it's a case of they will never be happy and we need to focus on outcomes.
So we might turn to the audience now. We've got some roving mics. Hey, hands straight up. So we might we'll go here first, and you just help them out by giving your name and where you're from, so they can pitch the answers. Peter.
Peter Wilson, Trangie, Narromine Trangie branch. Although, as Tony would agree with me, I think the name needs to change the other way around. I'm also treasurer of this association. I'm not an irrigator, but I've got irrigators not too far away. My question to the panel is, if we didn't have this insistence on keeping the lower lakes a metre and a half, or whatever it is, above sea level and keeping them fresh, how many gigalitres of water could that then make available to the either to the environment or back to irrigators?
I think we've all agreed that that's a Phil question.
Okay. I don't know the answer to that question, Peter, and I'm happy to take that on notice if you wanted it. I think it'd be a really hard calculation to make. But one thing I'd emphasise, everyone does focus on the waters flowing over the South Australian border and what it means for the Coorong and lower lakes and the Murray Mouth. It's a really, and I can understand why there's that focus here, but you've got to also understand that the way in which the Basin Plan has been designed is to make sure that we hit environmental targets up and down the basin. So I know there's an understandable focus on South Australia, but there's also, it's about improving the environment right up and from the very top to the very bottom, and I think that's often misunderstood. Even if we were to do something in the south, and there's been lots of proposals and suggestions about that, there's still the need for that water that ends up going out the pipe at the end to water multiple times as it goes down through the system for environmental benefit. One of the things we, as the MDBA, have struggled with is to articulate what are those benefits that you get within a region that's miles away from the mouth of the Murray from doing this, because we're trying to actually improve the health of the whole river system, not just the lower lakes.
All right, thanks, Phil. Helen? Yeah, no, happy for you to take turns.
I've got to wait. Oh, am I on? Yes.
Ah.
Hi, Debbie Buller from. I'm from Murray, which is actually right in smack bang in the middle of the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. I think my question's mostly aimed at Gavin and possibly even you, Scott, at a state level. One of the things that we're noticing is, sorry guys, but it is, one of the things that I'm noticing is that there's been a really almost practical dismemberment now between what we would call agriculture and this other thing called environment, which in our space, especially at the regulatory and academic level, okay, those two levels. So in our space, it appears to me that because I'm an irrigator, that the environment doesn't exist at my place, not there, okay? So some of what DPI generally wants to do, and in this instance DPI Water, what they want to do to progress is subject to, I'll just say, other partners. Will that do? It's subject to other partners or other departments, and you're beholden to things like concurrence signatures, okay? What I'd like you to explain to us is how we can actually navigate our way through this and close this gap so we can get on with it.
I guess that's one of our big challenges in finishing off the water resource plans that we've got to do. Once they're finished, they're not just for New South Wales DPI to sign off, DPI Water to sign off on. They actually need the Environment Minister to sign off on them. But not only that, then the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, or Phil, as a regulator in that context, has to sign off on these things as well. And we have to demonstrate that we've done a whole range of things as part of that, whether it be long-term environmental watering plans, which are developed by another agency, or even making sure that the original intent and the cap that was developed in 98, 99, or now the new SDLs, are delivered within that. So it's like these things are a zero-sum game, but everyone wants to have a little play around the edge. And I guess that's the judgment that we'll have to work with communities and those groups to try and navigate our way through here to make sure that we end up delivering plans that are compliant and can be ticked off by all those people. And that's going to be a challenge.
So I might just... Oh, no, you go first, Phil.
Sorry, just to add on, this is not a unique problem for New South Wales, and I think, Debbie, you should take some comfort from the fact that at COAG in June, you've got whole of government endorsement to this, which is not just the Agriculture Minister, the Environment Minister, the social ministers and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's a really important thing that we need to maintain, is that bipartisan support.
Steve?
Just to add a very quick point about it, that one of the original points you made about people thinking that farmers and environment were separate things, I mean, that is something which I think over time we can certainly work to overcome. The National Irrigators Council policy has a good environment as part of its core, but we know that there's work that rice farmers are doing with native birds. We know that there is work that farmers are doing in conjunction with the CHU on watering on their properties and wetlands on properties and things like that, and that's the sort of thing which I think we can encourage to get dual benefit out of these things as they go ahead.
I might just wrap up. I mean, it's a broader issue for us than just water, right? And it's actually flows from a lot of the discussions that you had yesterday around biodiversity. It flows to what we see as part of our core mission at the moment is to literally use the empowerment that our minister has given us by taking into government a strong position, which is those vested interests that previously have been seen to be needed to be separated out because they were a vested interest, whether it's in the use of the water, the environmental outcomes, are actually best placed to guide us in delivering those outcomes. So whether it's empowering the landowner to actually help deliver the best biodiversity outcomes, or empowering the water user to help us deliver the best water use outcomes. I mean, this is the platform that we've now been given. We've only been given it for a relatively short period of time so far, and we're still working on how we better sell that story to our counterparts across other parts of government who in all honesty have spent a long time being told the opposite. So, we know because we're out on the ground seeing what gets done. We know that the decisions that are made by landowners are never 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, or even in some cases single generation based decisions. Our job is to try to be your advocates better on that topic inside. So not that we don't, so that it actually makes concurrence easier rather than trying to work around it. And that's what we're trying to do day in, day out at the moment. So, Helen.
Helen Dalton from Griffith. I'm an irrigator and a dryland farmer. I'll put it to you bluntly, I suppose, that I believe, and we can see it out in our areas, that environmental flows have created an imbalance in the rivers. Recently, we've seen an increase in blue-green algae along the Murray and Murrumbidgee rivers, and there are some sustained blooms right now out at Barrenbog Swamp near Griffith, west of Griffith. Environmental flows are causing the collapse and subsidence of riverbanks. Along with the carp, the turbidity of the water is compromised and placing aquatic weeds under stress. Blue-green algae has been linked to serious health issues both for crops, livestock and for humans. As we use that water to irrigate, so it's a concern. The Basin Plan has concentrated on volumes of water, and this just flush mentality is negatively impacting on water quality. How will the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and DPI Water address this emerging issue, and it really is the elephant in the room, and who is going to be responsible for the impacts of poor management?
Thanks very much, Helen. Good question. When I started in the job, the briefing I was given was why did this thing all start? It was because the Murray Mouth had closed. There was a 1,000 kilometre blue-green algae slick in the Darling. We need to do something. And then you fast forward to last year and you go, similar sort of problems. So have we got anywhere? I think the point you make is a good one, and I don't think it's that well understood that within the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, it's not just about volume. There's a whole lot of stuff to do with water quality. There's a whole lot of other stuff that are in the plans that Gavin's referred to that we have to tick off. And so it has nevertheless been the complete and utter focus has been on the volume, and it's an important factor, but it's not the only factor in success. You're not going to get a healthy working basin if you're just focused on volume. So you might have noticed in our Northern Basin Review, which, given where you're from, you might not have seen it, but we went to some lengths to come up with these other measures which we called a toolkit, but they're non-flow measures that might help you achieve the healthy working basin objective without taking further water away from consumptive use. So I think it's a principle and it's a point you've made really well, and I can only agree with it. But it is one of our challenges will be to make sure that all of the other stuff that you've talked about is brought forward. We're not going to get there. And take your point also that you're making a similar point to the Wentworth Group as well, that so far, after 5 years of operation of the plan, which doesn't really come into effect for another 7 years, it's still having an impact, obviously, but we're not going to get to nirvana straight away. It's going to take us a long time to get there, but we've got to make sure that we don't just focus on volume.
So, because I can see how many hands are out there, we're going to go into a sort of sprint session here, right? So we're just going to go one person for the answer, and we are going to go down the back of the room because I know you. All right. Well, we got one down there with his hand up. Your arm's about to drop off. You've had it up that long. You got a mic in your hand, so you go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is to Phil. Hello, Phil. John O. Phelps from Whan. Phil, consultation meetings that you held in Whan and Gunnedah December last year moved and resolved a motion. The motion read that the MDBA, in liaison with government ministers, undertake work in the Namoi to review the in-stream requirements and present the results of this work to a meeting in Whan during the winter of 2017. For too long, we have heard about these in-stream requirements. For too long, the justification for these in-stream requirements has gone unchallenged. I call on the MDBA to deliver on the request made to the Whan and the Namoi community and endorsed at the Gunnedah meeting to present the results to our community. We do not need to create an artificial drought on some claim that cannot be justified. So, Phil, could you advise this meeting and us if the MDBA intend to action this request by the Namoi community? We are now in July, and in fact, at the meeting, your chairman, Neil Andrews, helped put this motion together. Thanks, Phil.
Thanks for the question, and Scott, I know you're interested in a short answer. I'll try and make it short. Certainly, except that we've got to do that. I think there's, as you're probably aware, there's two people involved in the dance here. There's the MDBA and there's also the New South Wales government, and we've been talking at some length, Gavin and I, about what is the best way to give effect to that broad outline that we've put forward in that Basin Plan amendment. It doesn't have to be resolved. The specifics of how we go about doing that doesn't have to be resolved by the time the amendment goes through. We've focused on making sure that the amendment's going to stand up to scrutiny. We have until 2019 to do the sort of detailed work that you're talking about. We certainly owe you a return visit. There's no doubt about that, and we'll bring that forward. But we have been focusing on getting the changes made, which, as you're aware, and I know not everyone in the room would support the amendments we put forward, but they do result in less water having to be returned to the environment.
Right, thank you. We'll go to the queue forming over this side here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Jeff Moore. I'm an irrigator from the Southern Riverina and a director on the West Koorugan Private Irrigation Scheme. Now, what my question is to you, I've heard you running down the Wentworth Group, which we agree with that. So I think that I'd like to take aim at the whole of the panel and ask, why is it that the lower lakes, the Coorong, is all disconnected out of your scheme? I thought we were talking about a whole of a Murray-Darling Basin arrangement. We've got the huge drainage schemes taking the water out of the southeast South Australian area out to the ocean. They've created a lot of the problems themselves, but no, you want to just cut off at the lower lakes. You are just putting so much of the work that's been put into infrastructure for irrigation in our area in jeopardy by taking the easy way out. There are a lot of problems. It's all about politics in South Australia. And I just think, why is it that we don't include the whole of the basin. And I just can't believe that you're prepared to sit there, all this money that is being used, and you want to chop off the little bit at the bottom. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. We, in part, answered part of this earlier on. Ultimately, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is not just about the Coorong and the lower lakes, number one. Number two, what we have is bipartisan support for a plan that was put forward in 2012 that defines what the basin is and defines particular environmental targets that we're trying to achieve, not just in the Coorong and the lower lakes, but all the way up and down the system. So I think it's a really important point to understand that we might all wish to have things differently to the way they are, but in order to get them differently to the way they are, because this stuff is locked in legislation, the Basin Plan is a piece of legislation, and because the way federation works, we have to get the agreement of every single minister to be able to make a change, and every single government to make a change to that. And so what we're doing is working within those constraints, and we're trying to find the best possible solution in that. I know it would be a lot easier if we didn't have to worry about South Australia, but unfortunately they are part of the deal, and it's very difficult to change that.
So I think we've got time for two more, so we're going to go here and then over to the microphone over here.
You're facing some major changes to the way river operates in the Murray system in order to supply new flow regimes to South Australia and to irrigation developments being developed on where people are buying up cheap lands and creating new irrigation developments downstream. So we're going to have a river system that has to meet demands to new demands for South Australia, new demands for irrigation schemes, etc. being developed. Now, as you're aware, I warned about constraints for 6 years, and that warning wasn't heeded until it took the state governments to instruct the MDBA to develop a constraints management strategy. Where we see at the moment in the Southern Basin, we talk about 650 of offset projects that can help mitigate going back into the market for and affecting irrigators. However, the riparian landholders are going to be absolutely decimated by this unless governments have a constructive relationship with the people most affected. And we have put out our hand to have that occur, but it's not. It can't go ahead unless the MDBA actually advise government that some of these flow regimes are not realistic. We have a system that was designed by our forefathers that recognised the height of the riverbanks. If we are going to go over the riverbanks, then clearly somebody's going to be flooded. Now, we talk about, social and economic impacts. In the Southern Basin, I understand that even if there is a report card done, it's not going to change the decision. Then we talk about the extra 450 political deal for 450 additional water and the terms of reference for the social and economic review of that. Riparian people aren't even in the terms of reference. So, and the other point is we are now going on this headline, very short time frame for consultation on all this. So we heard before that it's between now and December. Now, this is a highly complicated issue. There are people's rights and livelihoods. It's not just farmers, it's tourism, it's shires impact, a whole lot of impacts. This cannot be consulted on in a short time frame between now and December. Now, we were also promised that the SDL projects, the 650 projects, would not go up unless there was community support. That community support, in many respects, has not been able to be evaluated because we weren't consulted in a methodology that allowed us to have meaningful input and for you to recognise whether there was support or not. And I'll give you an example. Hume-Yarrawonga farmers, they haven't been talked to for 2 years, and yet the project went up. Same with the Yarrawonga to Warcool Junction. We didn't support what was put up, and yet it did. So how do we get round this issue that this appears to be all going to be rammed through in this incredibly unrealistic political timeframe and there's just going to be casualties on the way.
Great question. Gavin.
Thanks, Louise. I might offer a couple of clarifications on process about what I mentioned earlier. So certainly between now and Christmas, early New Year, we have to negotiate the funding arrangements and delivery arrangements with the other states in the Commonwealth. Now, those funding arrangements don't necessarily, or as I mentioned earlier, enable funding to flow. It doesn't mean that we can absolutely commit to what those projects will look like, because the first milestone we might have to get over is, in some cases, the consultative arrangements for the next 4 or 5 years as the projects progress through a series of gateways, if you like. So we have to be able to first get the money to flow to be able to properly engage at whatever scale we might need to, particularly in some of the projects that you're talking about in the riparian areas. So I don't anticipate by any means that consultation will be done and dusted by Christmas time this year. I actually expect that it'll roll over the next 18 months to 2 years rather than that short time frame, but we have to get the money to start flowing to be able to do that properly. I guess the second thing for me there is the projects that have gone up as part of the 650. I think I mentioned earlier that the states have agreed on a package of works and measures they believe are feasible to enable an offset. The next step for us depends on what comes back from the modelling from the MDBA. If it comes back that these projects, or which projects, or a combination of projects, we then have to negotiate whether the states are actually prepared to take what projects on. So I describe it as like a drop down of detail and decisions over the next probably 4 or 5 years, starting with what projects have we proposed as possibly feasible, what does the funding look like over the next let's say 6 months for the funding to flow, then consultation over a couple of years, and then finally the operating arrangements that will enable that infrastructure to work. Now, just to give a bit of a feel for operating arrangements on the Murray and the Darling, that's actually enshrined in the Basin Agreement itself, which has to be signed off by the Premiers. The current one, I think, took several years to negotiate, and I expect as we get closer to what projects are actually implemented, it'll take another several years to actually finalise and bed down whatever new operating arrangements might come out of that. So I think we've still got a long way, like Phil said, 5 years in 7. We're sort of at the halfway mark. We're not even half time yet. We've still got a lot of work to do.
And Louise, let's make sure that dialogue continues. One more question. Actually, we're going to make it a half question because Max, I'm going to give you another half question too.
Thanks, Scott. Wayne Dunford owns a property north of Whan, just north of the driest Ramsard area, I think, in Australia, Narran Lake, where we, if we're lucky, get one opportunity to pump stock and domestic water per year. Two quick questions. Were natural floodplains taken into account in the Murray-Darling Basin plan? And it was mentioned there earlier that Queensland has an issue of over-allocation, which we're all pretty aware of. What sort of action is being looked at to be taken up there?
Thanks, Wayne. I'm not quite sure what you mean by were floodplains taken into account. Happy to take that up separately, but in terms of Queensland, the single biggest bit of recovery of water as part of the Northern Basin Review is happening in Queensland. There's significant impacts in the Condamine Ballon as a result of their over-allocation of that water over the last 20 years. So it's not as though the brunt of this is being borne by New South Wales. Queensland's got some pretty significant heavy lifting to do.
So they were 2 quarter questions. Wayne? Max?
Max lived to Canandra, formerly on the Macquarie. I would hope that the Basin Plan is a living organism, because if we get a government with enough intestinal fortitude to build dams on, say, the Bell, Little River, Mandangery Creek, probably the Cranky Rock one, will that change the whole situation? And for God's sake, look at the socio-economic impact of buyback. Thank you.
In interest of time, yes, the whole basin plan is meant to be adaptive. We've talked about the year of change. 2017 is 2 examples of actually changing the plan, particularly in the north where we got new information in. If someone wanted to build another dam, if a government wanted to do that, okay, they bring it forward and they do it. I think you can't. I guess my learning from over the last 4 or 5 years has been that setting things in concrete now and then expecting them to continue on, it just doesn't work. We've got to be adaptive in this work.
And just quickly on dams, we were lucky enough to get some funding out of Canberra to do some pre-feasibility work on dam sites in the Lachlan and up north, and that work's still progressing, and there's some information on our website about what we're working on there as well.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this morning. Please join with me in thanking our panellists. So, as I hand back over to Derek and Matt, can I just continue to point out the point that Perin made about the need for good access to information. Make sure you're letting us know if there's other bits you need, other pieces of information you need. And picking up Tony's point, I know there's a lot of water politics, water fatigue out there at the moment, but when you hear what's coming in the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to have to sustain some momentum in terms of the interactions and the debates. So thank you very much for your focus.